The room went silent the second I set my laptop on the kitchen island and turned the screen toward her. My wife Lavisa was mid-sentence, mid-laugh, phone pressed to her ear, telling her sister something about how she didn't know how much longer she could carry this family financially. She saw the screen. She saw the number on it. And her mouth just stopped moving, like someone had reached into her throat and switched her off. "I have to call you back," she said into the phone, and hung up without waiting for a response. I didn't say anything yet. I let her look. I let her read the number twice, because I could see her doing the math behind her eyes, recalculating 4 years of a story she'd been telling everyone, including herself. My name is Wiki. I'm 41 years old. I own 38 properties across 3 states, a portfolio worth just under $50 million, built almost entirely in the last 6 years, almost entirely without my wife knowing the real numbers. And the woman standing in my kitchen, the one who had just told her sister she was carrying this family, had spent the better part of 4 years telling her friends, her book club, her parents, and apparently anyone who would listen, that I was a failure who couldn't hold down a real job. That night was the night she found out how wrong she'd been. But to understand how we got to that kitchen island, you have to go back to where this actually started, because the truth is, I let her believe it. For years, I let her believe it on purpose. I met Lavisa 9 years ago at a mutual friend's engagement party in Houston. I was 32, working a job in commercial property management that paid decently but not impressively, the kind of job you put on a name tag rather than a business card. She was 29, an event coordinator for a hospitality group, sharp, funny, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and within 10 minutes know which 3 people actually mattered. I was drawn to that. I'd spent my 20s being quietly observant in rooms full of louder people, and she had this gift of making the room organize itself around her without anyone noticing she'd done it. We dated for 14 months. We got married in a backyard ceremony in Sugar Land with about 60 guests, string lights, a band her cousin played in, the kind of wedding that feels handmade because it is. My parents drove down from Tulsa. Her parents hosted. It was simple and it was good, and I remember standing under those lights thinking I had figured out the one part of life that actually mattered. For the first 2 years, things were normal in the way most young marriages are normal. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment off Westheimer. I kept my job. She kept hers. We talked about kids, about a house, about the vague shape of a future neither of us had fully mapped yet. And then, in our 3rd year together, I bought my first investment property. It wasn't dramatic. It was a duplex in a part of Houston that hadn't gentrified yet, bought with money I'd been saving since I was 24, a habit my father had drilled into me since I was a teenager working weekends at his hardware store in Tulsa. My father, Daniel, was not a wealthy man, but he was a precise one. He believed that the people who talk the most about money are usually the ones who understand it the least, and the people who quietly accumulate it are the ones who actually do. He used to say that wealth built loudly gets spent loudly, and wealth built quietly tends to stay. I didn't tell Lavisa how much the duplex cost. I told her I'd picked up a property, that it was a small side investment, nothing that would change our day-to-day. She nodded, mildly interested, and went back to planning her sister's baby shower. That was the first time I noticed something about her that I would notice again and again over the years that followed. She was interested in money as a feeling, not as a mechanism. She liked the idea of security. She didn't particularly want to understand how it was built. I kept my job in property management for another year after that, partly because I needed the W-2 income for loan qualification purposes, and partly because I wasn't ready to tell anyone, including my wife, what I was actually building. I'd learned things in that job that most people never learn unless they're inside the industry: how undervalued properties get identified, how distressed sellers negotiate, how small multifamily buildings get systematically overlooked by big institutional buyers because the deal sizes are too small for them to bother with but too complex for individual buyers to navigate alone. I was sitting exactly in that gap. And I started filling it. By year 4 of our marriage, I owned 6 properties. Small multifamily buildings mostly, a few single-family rentals, all of it financed conservatively, all of it cash flowing. I still told Lavisa almost nothing specific. When she asked, I gave her round, soft numbers. It's going fine. We're building something. Don't worry about the details, I've got it handled. I see now how that sounds, like I was hiding something shameful. I wasn't. I was protecting a process. My father had told me once, when I was maybe 19, that the moment you start explaining your wins to people who didn't earn them with you, you start performing instead of building. I didn't want to perform. I wanted to build. What I didn't anticipate was what would grow in the space where information should have been. Lavisa's family was, by her own description, comfortable but careful. Her father had been a mid-level manager at an oil services company for 30 years, retired with a modest pension, the kind of household where money was discussed constantly because there was never quite enough slack in it to stop discussing. Her mother, Maria, had a habit of asking pointed questions at every family gathering. What does Wiki do exactly? Is he still at that property company? Are you two thinking about a bigger place yet? The questions were never cruel, but they were never neutral either. They were measuring. And because I gave Lavisa so little to work with, she started filling in the measurement herself, and not in my favor. I quit the property management job entirely in year 5. By then I had 12 properties and the rental income alone was outperforming my old salary by a significant margin. I told Lavisa I'd left to focus on the real estate stuff full time. She asked if that was smart. I told her it was. She didn't ask follow-up questions, and at the time I read that as trust. Looking back, I think it was something closer to resignation, the quiet decision to stop engaging with a part of my life she'd already decided not to take seriously. That's when the story she told started to calcify. I found out about it slowly, the way you find out about most things that have been happening around you for a while. Little comments at family dinners. Her cousin asking me, with a strange, careful kindness, if I was doing okay after I left my job. Her mother offering, unprompted, to help us out if we ever needed it, with an expression that suggested she expected we might need it sooner rather than later. At first I thought it was simple misunderstanding, the natural confusion that happens when a family doesn't have the full picture. I corrected it gently a few times. I'm doing well, actually. It's going better than fine. But the corrections never seemed to land. It was like trying to talk someone out of a movie they'd already watched twice. I started to understand the depth of it about a year and a half ago, at her sister's birthday dinner at a restaurant in the Heights. Lavisa's friend Sylvia, who I'd met maybe 4 times total, leaned across the table during a lull in conversation and said, with what she clearly believed was warmth, "You know, it's so admirable how Lavisa's held it together. Not every wife would stick around through that kind of instability." I remember setting my fork down very carefully. "What instability?" I said. Sylvia blinked, glanced at Lavisa, realized she'd said something she wasn't supposed to say in front of me. Lavisa laughed it off, said something like, "Oh, he's just being modest," and changed the subject to the dessert menu. I let it go that night. I sat with it instead. And over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention to the conversations happening around me, the ones I wasn't fully part of, the ones happening in group texts and at her book club and on phone calls in the next room. What I started to piece together was not a small misunderstanding. It was a complete, fully formed narrative, one she had apparently been telling for years. In that narrative, I was a man who'd had a stable job and walked away from it chasing a real estate dream that hadn't materialized. I was scraping by on a few small rental properties that barely covered themselves. I was, in her words to her sister during a call I happened to overhear from the hallway outside our bedroom, kind of treading water, but I don't want to make him feel worse about it. I was someone she was financially supporting in spirit if not always in fact, someone whose ego she had to manage, someone whose failures she had quietly absorbed so the people around her wouldn't think less of either of us. I stood in that hallway for a long time after I heard that. I didn't go in. I didn't confront her. I went downstairs, poured a glass of water I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table thinking about my father's chess set, the one he taught me on when I was 9, in the back room of the hardware store between customers. He used to say that the worst move you can make in chess is the one that tells your opponent what you're thinking before you've finished thinking it. Reaction is information. Silence is leverage. So I stayed silent. Not out of weakness, and not, I want to be clear, out of some need to punish her slowly. I stayed silent because I genuinely did not yet know what I was looking at. Was this insecurity? Was this a coping mechanism for her own family's quiet judgment? Was this something crueler, a story she found more comfortable to tell than the real one, because the real one would have required her to either engage with a life she'd checked out of, or admit that she'd built an entire social identity around being the long-suffering, practical one in a marriage to a man who couldn't get it together? I decided I needed more information before I decided anything else. And in the meantime, I kept building. I want to back up for a moment, because I think the day I bought that first duplex says more about who I am than almost anything else in this story, and it's worth sitting in for a minute before the rest of it unfolds. It was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because Tuesdays were my short days at the property management company, and I'd taken the afternoon off under the pretense of a dentist appointment that didn't exist. The duplex was on a quiet street in the 3rd Ward, 2 units, both occupied, both a little tired-looking, the kind of property that gets passed over by buyers who want something that photographs well and gets snapped up by buyers who understand that the photograph isn't the point. I'd found it through a wholesaler I'd met at a real estate meetup I attended alone, twice a month, for almost a year, without telling Lavisa where I was actually going on those Thursday nights. I told her it was a networking thing for work. It was, technically. Just not the work she thought. I closed on that duplex for $94,000, using savings I'd built since I was 24, plus a conventional loan I qualified for on my property management salary alone. I remember sitting in the title company's office, signing page after page, my hand a little unsteady, not from doubt but from the strange, quiet thrill of doing something that mattered entirely on my own. I drove straight from that closing to the duplex itself and sat in my car outside it for almost 20 minutes, just looking at it. 2 units. Tired paint. A chain-link fence that needed replacing. 940 square feet aside. It didn't look like much. It looked, to most people who would have driven past it, like exactly nothing. To me, it looked like the first sentence of a book I'd been wanting to write my entire adult life. I went home that night and told Lavisa I'd picked up a little property. She was making dinner, stirring something on the stove, half paying attention, the way you do with a partner's passing comment about their day. "That's exciting," she said, in the tone people use for comments that register as pleasant but not significant. "Is it a lot of work?" "It'll be some work," I said. "But I think it's a good buy." "Well, I trust you," she said, and went back to stirring. I think about that exchange a lot now, because at the time it felt like a small, sweet moment of partnership, my wife trusting my judgment without needing to interrogate every decision. In hindsight, I think it was the first brick in a wall that would take 6 years to finish building, the wall of vague, unexamined trust that eventually hardened into a complete absence of curiosity. She trusted me in the sense that she didn't worry about me. She did not trust me in the sense of wanting to actually understand what I was building. Those are 2 very different kinds of trust, and I didn't know yet how much that difference would eventually cost both of us. The duplex cash flowed almost immediately, about $380 a month after the mortgage, taxes, and insurance, which doesn't sound like much, and wasn't much, but it was real, and it was mine, and it taught me more in its first year of ownership than 2 years of reading investment forums had. I learned how to vet a contractor. I learned what a capital expenditure reserve actually needs to look like in practice, not in theory. I learned how a single missed inspection on a water heater can turn a good month into a bad one. I learned, mostly, that the gap between people who talk about real estate investing and people who actually do it is enormous, and that almost nobody crosses that gap, because crossing it requires doing a lot of unglamorous, unrewarded work in the dark before anyone, including your own spouse, has any reason to be impressed. I bought my second property 14 months later. A small single-family home in Pasadena, just outside Houston, bought from a seller going through a contentious divorce who needed a fast, clean close more than he needed top dollar. I paid $118,000 for a house that, 3 years later, after I'd put about $22,000 into updates, was appraised at $211,000 and renting for $1,650 a month. I told Lavisa about that purchase the same way I'd told her about the first one. Quiet. Vague. A side project. Something not worth disrupting the rhythm of our actual life over. By then, Hira was almost 2, and most of our conversations at home had narrowed, as they do with a toddler in the house, to the immediate and practical, naps, pediatrician appointments, whether we had enough diapers, whose turn it was to do the overnight feeding when she was younger. Real estate, my real estate specifically, simply wasn't competing for airtime in our marriage in any serious way, and I let that happen. I told myself it was because I didn't want to burden her with details that didn't matter yet. I think, if I'm honest, it was also because there was something deeply satisfying about having a part of my life that was entirely, privately mine, unmanaged by anyone else's opinion of it, unworried over by anyone else's anxiety. My father had been like that too, in his own way, a man who kept a substantial chunk of his modest savings in investments my mother only fully understood the scope of after he passed. I didn't think, at the time, that I was repeating a pattern. I think now that I almost certainly was. The third property, a fourplex in Spring, took the portfolio's monthly cash flow past what I was making at my actual job, a milestone I remember registering privately, almost ceremonially, while sitting in my car in our own driveway one evening before going inside, doing the math twice to make sure I hadn't made an error. I didn't tell Lavisa that milestone had happened. I didn't tell anyone. I sat with it by myself, the way you sit with a secret you're not entirely sure yet what to do with, and then I went inside and helped get Hira ready for bed and didn't say a word about it. That, I think, is the moment I'd point to now, if someone asked me exactly where the silence stopped being practical and started being something closer to a choice with consequences I hadn't fully reckoned with. I had just crossed a real threshold, the kind of threshold that changes the entire trajectory of a family's financial future, and I told no one. Not my wife. Not my parents. I went inside and read my daughter a book about a sleepy bear and put her to bed and made small talk with Lavisa about her sister's upcoming engagement party, and the whole time there was this number sitting in my chest like a stone I'd swallowed on purpose, and I didn't say a single word about it. I've asked myself many times since why I did that, and I think the honest answer has several layers. The first layer, the one I told myself at the time, was practical. I didn't want to disrupt the financial planning we'd already built around 2 incomes, didn't want her to start making decisions, spending decisions, comfort decisions, around money that wasn't fully proven out yet. The second layer, deeper, was about control, plain and simple. I liked being the only person who knew the real shape of what I was building. It made the work feel entirely mine in a way I'm not sure I'd ever felt about anything before. The third layer, the one I'm least proud of and the one I only fully understood after that night in the kitchen years later, was that some part of me was testing her. Not consciously, not with a plan, but testing nonetheless, watching to see whether she'd ask the right questions, whether she'd stay curious about the actual texture of my life or settle for the comfortable, low-resolution version of it. She settled. For 6 years, she settled. And I let her. There's a particular dinner I haven't mentioned yet, one that happened about 3 years into the pattern I've just described, that I think deserves its own space here, because it's the moment Lavisa's mother Maria first put the family's quiet judgment of me into words I couldn't pretend I'd misheard. We were at her parents' house for a Sunday dinner, nothing special, just the regular rotation of family meals that happened every few weeks. Hira was 4 by then, running around the backyard with her cousins while the adults sat around the table finishing a pot roast Maria had been making the same way for 30 years. Richard was talking about a new dealership his company was opening outside Austin. Lavisa's sister was talking about a promotion at her firm. And then, in the lull that happens at every family dinner when the conversation runs out of momentum, Maria turned to me and asked, in the gentle, probing way she had of asking the questions everyone else was thinking but too polite to voice, "So Wiki, how's the property thing going these days?" Leviza mentioned you've still got a few of those rental houses. A few of those rental houses. By then I had 9 properties, 2 of them small apartment buildings, generating a combined net income that, on a per-month basis, exceeded what either Richard or Leviza's sister made. But I didn't say any of that. I said, it's going fine. Slow and steady. Slow and steady, Maria repeated, nodding in a way that suggested she was filing the phrase away as confirmation of something she already believed. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Not everyone needs to be chasing some big empire. As long as you're providing for my grandbabies, that's what matters. I remember the specific, quiet sting of that sentence, providing for my grandbabies, delivered with the implicit suggestion that providing for them might be in some doubt, might require ongoing reassurance, might be a thing she needed to check on at a Sunday dinner the way you'd check on a patient's recovery. I said something non-committal, passed the green beans, and let the conversation move on to my sister-in-law's promotion, where it stayed for the rest of the meal. In the car on the way home, with Hira asleep in her car seat in the back, I almost said something to Leviza. I almost asked her directly, why does your mother think I'm barely scraping by? What have you told her? I had the words queued up, I remember the exact shape of the sentence in my mouth, and then I looked over at Leviza, tired after a long day, half watching the road go by, and I let it go. I told myself it wasn't worth starting an argument over on a quiet drive home with our daughter asleep in the back. I told myself I'd bring it up another time, when it mattered more, when there was a better moment. There is never a better moment. I understand that now. The better moment is a story you tell yourself to justify staying quiet in the moment that's actually in front of you. Over the years that followed, that exact pattern repeated itself more times than I can count. A comment at a birthday dinner. A pointed question from Richard about whether I'd thought about something more stable. A sympathetic look from Leviza's sister that I'd catch and then watch her quickly soften into a smile. Each time, I felt the same pull toward correcting it, and each time, I found a reason the moment wasn't quite right, a reason that usually amounted to, it'll seem like I'm bragging, or, it'll start a fight, or, it doesn't matter what they think as long as I know the truth. It does matter, as it turns out. It mattered enormously, just not in the way I expected. It didn't matter because their opinion of my bank account was somehow essential to my self-worth. It mattered because their accumulated, unanswered assumptions became the raw material Leviza used to build the story she eventually told herself, and then everyone else, about who I was and what our marriage actually looked like from the inside. By the time Jack was born, 4 years into the silence, the story had calcified into something close to family lore. I remember a conversation at Jack's first birthday party, a small gathering in our backyard, where Leviza's cousin, a woman named Sylvia I mentioned earlier in connection with the birthday dinner comment, pulled Leviza aside near the drink cooler, not realizing I was close enough to hear over the noise of the kids' inflatable pool. "How are you guys doing, really?" Sylvia asked, in the particular hushed tone reserved for checking in on someone you believe to be quietly struggling. "We're managing," Leviza said, and there was something practiced in how easily the phrase came out, the exact phrase I'd use later, almost word for word, when Danish asked me the same question at the school fundraiser years afterward. "We're managing." It's a phrase that sounds like reassurance and functions like confirmation. It's tight some months, but we make it work. I just don't really bring it up because I don't want him to feel bad about it. He's trying, you know. I just try to handle the budgeting stuff myself so he doesn't have to stress about it on top of everything else. I stood there by the grill, flipping burgers for a 1-year-old's birthday party, listening to my wife construct, in real time, an entire emotional architecture around a financial reality that was, by any objective measure, the opposite of struggling. And I want to be honest, in that specific moment, I didn't feel angry. I felt something stranger, almost like watching a movie about someone else's life, a kind of detached, clinical curiosity about how completely she believed what she was saying. There was no calculation in her voice. No malice. She wasn't performing for effect, not in any way she was conscious of. She believed it. She had built it carefully enough, over years, that it had become simply true to her, the way a story you've told often enough eventually replaces your actual memory of the event it was based on. That's the part of this whole experience that I think people miss when they hear the short version of the story, the version where a man secretly built a $50 million portfolio while his wife told everyone he was a failure. It sounds, told that way, like a deliberate campaign of cruelty on her part, and I don't think that's accurate, and I don't think it's fair to her, even now, even after everything. I think what actually happened is something quieter and more universal and, in some ways, more troubling. Two people stopped checking their assumptions against each other's reality, for years, and the gap between assumption and reality grew so wide, on both sides, that by the time it finally collapsed, it collapsed all at once, in a kitchen, on a Tuesday night, instead of correcting itself gradually the way honest small course corrections would have allowed it to. I think about my father's chess lessons again here, because there's a principle in chess that applies almost perfectly to what happened in my marriage, something he used to call the cost of a quiet move. In chess, the most dangerous moves aren't always the loud, aggressive ones. Sometimes the most dangerous move on the board is the quiet one, the one that doesn't look like it's doing anything, the pawn that shifts one square, the bishop that repositions without taking anything. Those moves can be brilliant, when they're part of a plan you're actively executing. But they can also be catastrophic, when you make them without realizing you've made them at all, without realizing that a quiet, harmless-looking shift has just changed the entire shape of the board in ways you won't understand until several moves later, when it's too late to take it back. I made a lot of quiet moves over those 6 years. Some of them were strategy. I want to be honest that not all of them were. Some of them were just avoidance, dressed up afterward as patience. Over the next 18 months, the portfolio grew faster than it had in any stretch before. I developed relationships with 2 distressed asset brokers in Dallas and 1 in San Antonio, people who brought me deals before they ever hit the open market, foreclosures and probate sales and small apartment complexes owned by aging landlords who just wanted out without the hassle of listing. I wasn't doing anything glamorous. I was doing the unglamorous work of underwriting deals at midnight after everyone in the house was asleep, driving out to inspect roofs and foundations on Saturday mornings while Liza thought I was out dealing with property stuff in some vague, undefined way, refinancing properties as they appreciated to pull capital for the next acquisition, and reinvesting almost everything instead of spending it. We had 2 children by then. My daughter Hira was 7, sharp as a tack, the kind of kid who asks why 3 times in a row until she actually understands the mechanism behind something instead of just the fact of it. My son Jack was 4, still mostly interested in dinosaurs and whether or not we were having pizza. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters to the rest of this story. The reason I kept the numbers quiet wasn't only about my father's lessons on leverage and silence. It was also about them. I did not want my children growing up in a household where money was a performance, where net worth got discussed at the dinner table like a scoreboard, where Hira would learn to measure her own worth by a number on a screen the way I'd watched some of my wealthier clients' kids do. I wanted them to grow up thinking we were comfortable, stable, fine, and nothing more dramatic than that. In hindsight, I built a structure that protected my children from a kind of distortion, while accidentally feeding a different distortion in my marriage. I didn't see that trade-off clearly until much later. The properties themselves were unglamorous in the way that real wealth almost always is. A 12-unit apartment building in a working-class neighborhood in San Antonio that I bought for $640,000 stabilized over 18 months until it was generating $11,000 a month in net rental income. A strip of 4 single-family homes in a Dallas suburb, bought individually over 2 years from sellers who needed to move fast, now worth nearly triple what I paid combined. A mixed-use building in Houston's East End, 3 retail units on the ground floor and 6 apartments above, bought at a probate auction for a fraction of its eventual value because the heirs just wanted it gone. None of it was the kind of property you'd see in a glossy investment brochure. All of it was the kind of property that, bought right and managed patiently, compounds. By the time my daughter Hira turned 8, I had crossed 30 properties. The portfolio's equity, after debt, sat somewhere north of $38 million. I knew this number precisely because I'd started working with a wealth management firm out of Dallas, run by a methodical woman named Natasha, who reviewed my holdings quarterly and who, on more than one occasion, asked me directly why my household financial picture, as she diplomatically called it, seemed to exist in a separate universe from my actual life. I told her it was complicated. She didn't push. That's part of why I kept her as my advisor. She understood that some clients needed a strategist, not a therapist. It was around this time that the comments at family gatherings shifted from vague pity into something with a sharper edge. At Thanksgiving that year, hosted at Levisa's parents' house, her father Richard, who was not unkind but was deeply transactional in how he viewed the world, pulled me aside in the garage where he kept his tools and asked, not unkindly, if I'd thought about maybe going back into something more stable. He said it the way you'd talk to someone recovering from an illness. He told me he didn't want to overstep, but that he worried about Levisa carrying more than her share, and that there was no shame in admitting when an entrepreneurial venture hadn't panned out the way I'd hoped. He offered, again not unkindly, to make a call to a friend of his who ran property management for a REIT downtown, said they were always looking for steady hands. I thanked him. I told him I'd think about it. I did not correct him. I want to pause here and be honest about why, because I've turned this decision over many times since and I don't think the answer is flattering, not entirely. Part of it was strategy, the same instinct that had served me well in every negotiation I'd ever been part of. Never reveal your position until you understand exactly what the other side believes and why. But part of it, if I'm being fully honest, was something closer to wounded pride curdling into something colder. I had built something real. I had built it carefully, patiently, at real personal cost, working nights and weekends for years while my own wife told people I was failing. And there was a part of me, a part I'm not entirely proud of, that wanted to know exactly how far the story would go before it broke. I wanted to see the full shape of what she'd built before I decided what to do about it. That winter, I overheard another conversation, this one more damaging than the others, and it's the one that finally moved me from observation into preparation. Levisa had a standing Thursday night call with her closest friend, a woman named Rose she'd known since college, who lived in Austin and worked in commercial banking. I wasn't trying to listen. I'd come downstairs for water and Levisa was on the back patio, phone on speaker, voice carrying through the screen door in the quiet of a Thursday night when she thought everyone was asleep. I mean, I love him, Rose, I do, but I'm exhausted. I'm the one keeping this family financially upright. He's got what, like a couple rental houses that barely break even after the mortgage and the repairs eat everything. I don't even ask anymore because the answer's always some version of, it's getting better. It's been getting better for 6 years. Rose said something I couldn't quite make out. No, I know he works hard, I'm not saying he's lazy, I'm saying I think he picked the wrong thing to be stubborn about. Some men just need everyone to believe they're the provider even when they're not, you know. I just go along with it because what's the alternative, humiliate him in front of his own kids? So I just carry it. Quietly. I don't even tell my mom the real numbers anymore because she'll just worry. I stood in the kitchen in the dark for a long time after that, the glass of water sweating in my hand, untouched. What struck me wasn't even the inaccuracy of it, though God knows it was inaccurate down to the studs. What struck me was the tone. There was no malice in her voice. She believed what she was saying. She had constructed, brick by brick, a story in which she was the quiet hero absorbing a slow-motion failure, and she had told that story so many times, to so many people, that it had become load-bearing in her own sense of herself. She wasn't lying to humiliate me. She was lying because at some point the lie had become more comfortable than asking the one question that would have unraveled it, Wiki, what is actually going on with your business? She never asked that question. Not once, in 6 years. And I never offered the answer, not because I was hiding shame, but because somewhere along the way, her not asking had started to feel like its own kind of answer, and I'd stopped expecting her to. That night, after I went back upstairs and lay next to her in the dark, listening to her breathing even out into sleep, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Confrontation without proof, without a complete picture, is just an argument, and arguments get won by whoever's more emotionally convincing in the moment, not by whoever's actually right. I needed something undeniable. Something she couldn't reframe, couldn't soften, couldn't explain away with "that's not what I meant," the way people always do when the words they actually said get held up in front of them. I decided I was going to let her keep telling the story. And I was going to keep building, quietly, until the gap between the story and the truth became too wide to survive contact with reality. I didn't know yet exactly how that contact would happen. I just knew it would, eventually, because lies built on a mission have a particular kind of fragility. They don't fail gradually. They hold and they hold and they hold, and then one day a single fact lands in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the whole structure goes down at once. I didn't have to wait as long as I expected. I should introduce Natasha properly here, because she became, over the years I'm describing, one of the only people who actually understood the full shape of what I was building, and her perspective on my silence matters to how this story eventually resolved. Natasha ran a boutique wealth management practice out of Dallas, the kind of firm that doesn't advertise because it doesn't need to, built almost entirely on referrals from people who'd quietly done very well and wanted someone equally quiet to help them keep doing well. I'd been referred to her by one of my distressed asset brokers around the time the portfolio crossed 15 properties, back when I'd started realizing I needed a more sophisticated approach to entity structuring, tax strategy, and long-term estate planning than I could manage with a spreadsheet and good instincts alone. Our first meeting was in her office on the 17th floor of a building off the Dallas North Tollway, glass walls, a view of the highway curling out toward the suburbs, and Natasha herself, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, the kind of person who asks exactly as many questions as necessary and not one more. She walked through my holdings that day with the same flat precision my father brings to a chessboard, occasionally making a small sound of approval, occasionally circling something on a printed page and asking a pointed question about financing structure. About 40 minutes into that first meeting, she set her pen down and looked at me directly. "Can I ask you something that's not strictly about the numbers?" "Sure." "Does your wife know the scope of this?" I remember the question landing somewhere uncomfortable, because it was the first time anyone outside my own head had asked it so plainly. "Not exactly," I said. "She knows I do real estate. She doesn't know the specifics." Natasha nodded slowly, the way you nod at a number that technically reconciles but that you suspect is hiding something underneath it. "I'm not going to tell you how to run your marriage," she said. "That's not my department. But I will tell you, from a strictly practical standpoint, that I've seen this pattern before with clients, and it rarely resolves itself on its own. The longer the gap sits there unaddressed, the more expensive it gets to close. Not in dollars. In trust." I told her, that day, something close to what I told my father later, that I wasn't hiding anything shameful, that I just didn't see the need to make a production out of numbers that weren't fully proven out yet. Natasha didn't push back hard. She just said, in the dry, economical way she said most things, "Just don't be surprised when the bill for that silence eventually comes due. It always does. The only question is what currency you pay it in." I thought about that sentence more times over the following years than I'd like to admit. It surfaced, uninvited, during the fundraiser with Danish. It surfaced again in the hallway outside our bedroom, listening to Lavisa tell Rose she had us covered. By the time the kitchen scene actually happened, 3 years after that first meeting with Natasha, I understood exactly what currency the bill had been accumulating in the whole time. Not dollars. Years. Years of my own family believing a story about me that wasn't true, years of my children growing up hearing, in the background noise of adult conversation, the implication that their father was somehow falling short, years of a marriage where my wife and I had stopped actually talking to each other about the thing that, financially, structured almost every choice we made. Our meetings continued quarterly after that first one, and Natasha became, in a strange way, one of the few people who had a complete, accurate picture of my life, more complete in some ways than my own wife's picture of it. We'd review acquisitions, refinances, the slow methodical compounding of equity across the portfolio. She watched the number climb from 15 properties to 22, then to 30, then past 35, each quarter delivering the same calm, professional assessment, occasionally punctuated by that same dry warning about the bill eventually coming due. I want to include one specific meeting here, because it happened not long before the fundraiser with Danish, and I think it shows how close I was, even then, to correcting course before the situation forced my hand. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, about a year before the kitchen scene, and Natasha had just finished walking me through the year's appreciation numbers, a particularly good year, the portfolio's equity having grown by nearly $6 million in 12 months through a combination of strategic acquisitions and broader market appreciation in the submarkets I'd concentrated in. She closed the folder, leaned back in her chair, and said, "You know, you could just tell her. Pick a Tuesday. Sit her down. Show her the actual picture. I've watched this number grow for 3 years now, and every quarter I think, this is the one where he finally does it, and every quarter you don't." "I know," I said. "Is there a reason you're still not doing it? A real reason, not the one about not wanting to make a production of it?" I sat with that question longer than I usually sat with Natasha's questions, because I didn't have a clean answer ready. Eventually I said something close to the truth. "I think I'm afraid of what it means about the last few years if I tell her now. If I show her the number, she has to ask herself why she didn't ask sooner, and I have to ask myself why I let her not ask for this long. I think some part of me has been waiting for a moment that feels clean, instead of a moment that just feels necessary." Natasha nodded slowly. "There's no clean moment," she said. "I've watched a lot of families go through exactly this, in both directions. Money hidden from a spouse who suspected too little, money hidden from a spouse who suspected too much and built a grievance around it. The ones that come out the other side fine are the ones who stop waiting for clean and just do necessary. The ones that don't, wait for clean long enough that necessary turns into a crisis instead of a conversation." I left her office that day fully intending to tell Lavisa within the month. I didn't. The school fundraiser happened a few weeks later, the Danish conversation happened, and somewhere in the wounded, calculating part of me that I've already admitted to, the part that wanted to see exactly how far the story would go before I stepped in, I let the window close again. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. I think, honestly, some part of me had started to enjoy holding a card nobody else at the table knew I had, and enjoying that feeling is a different thing entirely from protecting my family, even though for a long time I let myself blur the two together. It took the kitchen scene, the actual breaking point, for me to finally do what Natasha had been telling me to do for 3 straight years. The breaking point came at Hira's school fundraiser, of all places, 8 months ago, in a gymnasium decorated with crepe paper and folding tables, surrounded by 100 parents from a private school whose tuition I paid in full every single semester without a second thought. It was a silent auction night, the kind of event where the PDA tries to raise money for new playground equipment by getting parents to bid on gift baskets and weekend getaways donated by local businesses. Lavisa had volunteered to help organize it, which meant we knew most of the other organizing parents, which meant the conversation that night happened in front of an audience that mattered to her in a very specific, social way. I'd shown up straight from a property closing in San Antonio, still in a sport coat, a little late, a little distracted, checking a text from my title company about a wire transfer. I found Lavisa near the dessert table talking to a small cluster of parents I half recognized, including a man named Danish, whose daughter was in Hira's class, and who ran some kind of mid-sized commercial insurance brokerage that, from what I understood, he discussed at every possible opportunity. "There he is," Lavisa said as I walked up, and there was something in her voice, a brightness that didn't quite reach her eyes, the same performed warmth I'd started to recognize from the hallway conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. "Wiki, you remember Danish. Good to see you," I said, shaking his hand. Danish smiled the particular smile of a man who has decided, somewhere upstream of this conversation, that he already understands exactly where he stands relative to you. "Lavisa was just telling us about the new house you guys are thinking about. Big step." I hadn't heard anything about a new house. I kept my face still. "Still early days on that. She mentioned you've been doing the real estate thing for a while now," Danish continued, swirling the wine in his plastic cup with the easy confidence of a man making conversation he doesn't expect to be challenged on. Tough market for the small guys right now, I'd imagine. Rates have crushed a lot of the little landlords I know. You holding up okay out there? We're managing, I said. He's being modest, Lavisa said, laughing, and reached out to pat my arm in a gesture that I'm sure looked affectionate from across the room and felt, to me, like being patted on the head. It's been a grind, honestly. I keep telling him there's no shame in scaling back if it's not penciling out. We're fine either way. I've got us covered. There it was, in front of a man I'd met twice, in a gymnasium full of parents whose children sat next to my daughter every day. I've got us covered. Danish nodded with the particular sympathy of someone who has just confirmed something he already suspected. Honestly, man, respect for sticking with it. Most guys would have folded and gone back to AW2 by now. I always tell people, there's no ego in knowing when to pivot. I want to be precise about what happened in me in that moment, because it wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something quieter and colder, the same sensation I get when I'm 3 properties deep into a portfolio analysis and I find the one number that doesn't reconcile, the one error that means the whole model needs to be rebuilt. I looked at my wife, laughing easily, comfortable in a story she told so many times it had become true to her, and I understood, finally and completely, that this wasn't a misunderstanding I could correct with a sentence. This was an identity. Hers. Built, brick by brick, on my silence. I didn't say anything else that night. I smiled, made some non-committal comment about markets being tough for everyone, and walked away to find Hira's art project on display near the gym entrance. I stood there for a long time looking at a papier-mâché volcano my daughter had made, thinking about a 12-unit building in San Antonio that had closed that afternoon for $1.9 million, $640,000 of which I'd put in 6 years earlier, thinking about how the woman I married had just told a stranger she had us covered. I drove home separately from Lavisa that night. I told her I needed to swing by the office, which was technically true, except the office was a property I owned outright in the East End that I used for exactly this kind of quiet, undisturbed thinking. I sat in that empty mixed-use building, in the unit I kept as a workspace above the retail space, and I called my father. Daniel picked up on the second ring, the way he always does, like he's been sitting by the phone waiting for exactly this kind of call his entire life, even though I know he wasn't. Something happened, he said. Not a question. My father has never needed questions to know when something's happened. I told him about the fundraiser. About the hallway conversation months earlier. About 6 years of round numbers and vague answers, and it's getting better and I've got us covered. I told him about Richard offering to call his REIT friend. I told him everything, in the flat, organized way I report on a deal that's gone sideways, because that's the only way I knew how to say it without my voice doing something I didn't want it to do. My father was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Did you ever tell her the real numbers? He asked finally. Straight out. Not hint at it. Tell her. No, I said. Then you both built this, he said, and it wasn't an accusation, just an observation, delivered with the same flat precision he'd used to teach me chess 30 years earlier. You built a silence and she filled it with a story that made her the hero. That's not entirely on her, son. People fill silence with whatever makes the most sense of their own life. You gave her an empty room and she furnished it. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. He was right, and it didn't make what she'd said any less humiliating, any less corrosive, but it reframed the question I needed to answer. The question wasn't just what do I do about her. It was also what was I actually protecting, all these years, by staying silent, and was it still worth protecting? I decided that night that the silence was over. Not in an explosive way. Not in a way that would make a scene in a gymnasium or a dining room. I am not, and have never been, a man who confuses volume with strength. I decided I would simply, finally, let her see the whole picture, all at once, undeniable, and let her sit with what that meant about the story she'd been telling for 6 years. It took me another 5 months to find the right moment, not because I was stalling, but because I wanted the reveal to happen on terms that made the truth impossible to soften or spin. I didn't want a conversation she could later describe to Rose as he got weirdly defensive or to her mother as he made it into this whole big dramatic thing. I wanted a single, clean, factual moment that she would have to sit inside of without any room to maneuver. That moment came on a Tuesday night in March, in our kitchen, when she was on the phone with her sister, telling her, almost word for word, the same story I'd overheard on the patio over a year earlier. I want to go back to the fundraiser for a moment, because I compressed a lot of that night into a short scene earlier, and there's more to it that matters, particularly what happened after I walked away from Danish and Leviza, while I was standing in front of my daughter's papier-mâché volcano pretending to admire glue and red tissue paper while my entire understanding of my marriage quietly reorganized itself. Richard found me there, a few minutes later, holding a plastic cup of the gymnasium's terrible punch, and made the kind of small talk fathers-in-law make at school events, asking about Hira's grades, commenting on how fast Jack was growing. And then, almost as an afterthought, in the same gentle, concerned register he'd used in the garage years earlier, he said, "You know, I was talking to a guy at the club last week, runs leasing for a REIT downtown, big operation, good benefits. I mentioned you might be a good fit if things ever get to a point where you want something more, I don't know, dependable. No pressure. Just wanted you to know the door's open." I looked at him for a long moment before answering, longer than the comment probably warranted, because I was doing the math in my head, not financial math this time, but a different kind of accounting. How many times, over how many years, had this exact conversation happened in some form, at some family gathering, delivered with this exact tone of well-meaning concern, built entirely on a foundation that had never once been checked against reality. "I appreciate that, Richard," I said. "I'll keep it in mind." "No shame in it," he said, clapping me on the shoulder in the particular way men of his generation clap shoulders when they believe they've just been generous. "Leviza's a strong woman. She can carry a lot. But every family does better with two incomes really pulling weight, you know." I didn't say anything else. I smiled, thanked him again, and walked back toward the silent auction tables, where Leviza was laughing with two other mothers from Hira's class, completely unaware, I believe genuinely unaware, of the conversation that had just happened 20 feet away from her, a conversation that was, in its own quiet way, just as damaging as anything Danish had said earlier, because it came from someone whose opinion of me Leviza actually valued, someone whose approval she'd been chasing, consciously. Or not, for as long as I'd known her. I drove to my office that night, the one above the East End retail units, the same building I described going to after that conversation, and I sat in the dark for a long time before I called my father. But there's a detail I left out of that account, one I think matters. Before I called him, I sat at my desk and pulled up the portfolio summary on my laptop, just to look at it. 36 properties at that point. 46 million in equity. I sat there looking at a number that represented, by any reasonable measure, one of the more significant private real estate portfolios built by a single individual in that part of the state over that time frame, and I felt, simultaneously, enormous pride and a strange, hollow loneliness, because not one person at that fundraiser, not Danish, not Richard, not even my own wife, had any idea that number existed. I had built something extraordinary entirely inside a silence so complete that the people closest to me had constructed an entirely different, smaller, sadder story to fill the space where the truth should have been. That's the night I understood, fully, for the first time, that the silence wasn't protecting anything anymore. It had stopped protecting the deal, stopped protecting my privacy, stopped protecting anything real. It had just become a kind of self-imposed exile from being known by the people who were supposed to know me best. My father, on the phone that night, after I told him everything, asked me a question I haven't mentioned yet, one that I think is worth including here because it cuts closer to the heart of things than almost anything else he said. "Do you want her to feel ashamed when she finds out," he asked, "or do you want her to actually understand what happened?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Figure that out before you do anything," he said. "Because those are two different plans, son, and they lead to two different places. If you want her ashamed, you can absolutely get that. You've got more than enough leverage to make her feel about as small as she's made you feel for the last 6 years. But shame doesn't fix a marriage. It just evens a score. If you actually want to fix this, you need a different plan than the one that would feel best in the moment. I sat with that for the rest of the drive home that night, long after we'd hung up, turning it over the way I'd turn over a deal that had two viable paths forward, one that maximized short-term return and one that maximized long-term value, and I knew, the way I always know with those kinds of decisions, which one I actually wanted, even though the other one would have been easier and more immediately satisfying. I decided, somewhere on Highway 59 heading back toward our house, that when the moment finally came, I wasn't going to use the numbers as a weapon. I was going to use them as a fact. There's a difference, and it's a difference that determines almost everything about how a person receives hard information. A weapon is designed to win. A fact is designed to be true, regardless of who it benefits. I wanted Leviza to experience the truth as a fact she had to reckon with, not as an attack she had to defend against, because facts, eventually, change people's understanding of themselves in ways that attacks never do. Attacks just make people dig in. It took another 5 months from that night to the actual kitchen scene, and I've already described some of what filled that gap, the continued building, the continued overhearing of conversations I wasn't meant to hear. But I want to add one more piece here, because it's relevant to understanding why I finally moved when I did, on that specific Tuesday in March, and not a month earlier or a month later. About 2 weeks before the kitchen scene, Leviza came to me, unprompted, with something that had clearly been weighing on her. We were in bed, lights off, the particular hour when people sometimes say things they wouldn't say in daylight. "I've been thinking," she said, "maybe I should look into picking up more hours at the design firm. Or even going back to it full time. I know things are tight, and I don't want you feeling like you're carrying all of it by yourself forever." I lay there in the dark for a long moment, and I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't anger, not even frustration exactly. It was something closer to grief. My wife, lying next to me in our own bed, was offering to go back to work full time, was offering to reorganize her own career, her own time with our children, because she genuinely believed our family's financial situation required it. She believed it so completely that she was willing to make a real, costly sacrifice based on a story that had never once been true. "You don't need to do that," I said quietly. "I want to help," she said. "I know you've been carrying a lot. I just want you to know I see it, and I'm willing to step up more." I didn't tell her the truth that night. I know how that sounds, given everything I've already said about deciding to use facts instead of weapons. But I want to be honest that even good decisions don't arrive instantly, fully formed, ready to execute. I lay there in the dark, listening to my wife offer to sacrifice her own time with our children based on a lie I had allowed to exist for 6 years, and I told myself, one more time, that the moment wasn't quite right, that I needed a little more preparation, a cleaner set of documents, a better setting for the conversation. It was 2 weeks after that, on the Tuesday I've already described, that I finally stopped waiting for the moment to be right and simply made it happen. I'd come home early that night, around 6:40, after closing on a fourplex in a Dallas suburb that pushed the portfolio's total property count to 38. I remember the number specifically because I'd been tracking it the way some people track a personal record, not for ego, but because it was a way of measuring something real against the noise of everything I wasn't saying out loud. I walked in through the garage, set my keys on the hook by the door, and heard Leviza's voice from the kitchen before I saw her, mid-call, mid-sentence, the cadence I recognized instantly because I'd heard a version of it so many times by then that it had its own rhythm in my head. "I don't know how much longer I can keep carrying this, honestly. Between Hyra's school and Jack's activities and just, everything, I feel like I'm the only one actually thinking about money in this house. He means well, I really believe that, but meaning well doesn't pay for things, you know." I stood in the doorway between the garage hall and the kitchen for a moment, listening, not because I needed more evidence, I'd had enough evidence for a year, but because some part of me wanted to hear, one more time, exactly how complete the story had become, so that what I was about to do would feel proportionate rather than impulsive. I just don't say anything because what's the point? He gets so sensitive about it. I've basically stopped expecting him to fix it. I just handle things myself now. It's easier. I walked into the kitchen. She glanced up, gave me the small distracted wave people give when they're mid-conversation, and kept talking for another few seconds before something in my expression must have registered, because she said into the phone, "I have to call you back," and hung up. "You're home early," she said. "Closing finished ahead of schedule," I said. I set my laptop bag on the counter, took out the laptop, and opened it. I'd pulled the documents together over the previous week, not in a frantic, reactive way, but methodically, the way I build anything, a portfolio summary from Natasha's firm showing total holdings, net equity after debt, monthly cash flow across all 38 properties, year-over-year appreciation, the works. Clean. Undeniable. The kind of document that doesn't argue with you, it just sits there being true. I turned the screen toward her. "What is this?" she said, and I could already hear something shifting in her voice, the particular caution of someone who senses the ground is not where they thought it was. "It's our financial position," I said. "All of it. Every property, every account, total equity, monthly income. I wanted you to actually see it instead of guessing at it." She leaned in. I watched her eyes move across the screen, watched them stop on the total net worth line, watched her read it once, and then again, the way you reread a number that doesn't fit into any sentence you currently know how to build. "This says 49.6 million, she said quietly. 49.6, I confirmed. Across 38 properties. Net of all debt. She looked up at me. "I don't understand. You told me it was tight. You told me the rentals barely covered themselves." "I never said that," I said, and I kept my voice level, the same register I use when I'm walking a seller through a number they don't want to hear in a negotiation. "I said it was going fine. I said I had it handled. You filled in the rest yourself, and I let you, because for a long time I didn't think it mattered who knew the exact number, as long as the family was provided for. And we have been provided for. Every bill, every tuition payment, every vacation, every car. All of it came from this. You let me think," she started, and stopped, and started again. "You let me tell people we were struggling. You let my dad offer to get you a job. You let me say, in front of people, that I had us covered." "Yes," I said. "I did. Why would you do that?" I want to be honest about the answer I gave her that night, because it wasn't a clean, righteous answer, and I don't think the moment called for one. At first, because I was building something and I didn't want to perform it before it was finished. Later, because I started hearing what you actually told people about me, and some part of me wanted to know how far you take it before you stopped to ask me directly what was true. You never asked, Lavisa. 6 years. You never once sat me down and asked, what is actually happening with the business. You built an entire story about me out of silence, and you never checked it against anything. She sat down at the island, slowly, the way people sit when their legs have stopped being fully reliable. "I called you a failure," she said, almost to herself. "I told Sylvia you were treading water. I told my mother I didn't tell her the real numbers because she'd worry. I told Rose I was the one carrying this family." "I know," I said. "I heard most of it. Not all of it secondhand, either. Some of it I heard directly, standing in this kitchen, on nights you thought everyone was asleep." Her face did something complicated then, shame and anger and disbelief moving across it almost simultaneously, the particular expression of someone realizing that the version of themselves they'd been performing for years had an audience they never accounted for. "You spied on me. I overheard my wife on our own patio," I said. "I wasn't hiding in a closet. You were loud enough to carry through a screen door." She put her head in her hands for a moment. When she looked up, her voice had changed, gone smaller. "Why didn't you just tell me? Any of the times this came up? Why let it go on for years instead of just saying, hey, that's not actually accurate?" It's the question I'd asked myself the most, in the months leading up to that night, and I gave her the most honest answer I had. Because somewhere in the last few years, Lavisa, I stopped believing you actually wanted to know. I think if I'd corrected you the first time, at dinner with your family, you'd have brushed it off as me being defensive, and the story would have kept going anyway, just with an asterisk you'd have ignored. I think the story was useful to you. It made you the responsible one. The one holding it together. The one your family could be proud of in a specific, legible way, instead of a wife whose husband did something complicated and unglamorous that nobody at your sister's birthday dinner could easily picture. I think it was easier to be the woman quietly carrying a struggling husband than the woman whose husband was building something she'd stopped paying close enough attention to understand. She didn't argue with that. That, more than anything she said that night, told me I was right. What happens now, she asked, and there was real fear in the question, the kind that comes when someone realizes the floor they've been standing on for years was never quite where they thought it was. I don't know yet, I said honestly. I'm not going to pretend I have a clean plan for this part. I know what I built. I know what it cost me to build it quietly. And I know I'm done being a story you tell instead of a person you actually talk to. I closed the laptop. I didn't raise my voice once during that entire conversation, and I want to be clear about why, because I think it's the part of this whole story that matters most. I have built every meaningful thing in my life, every property, every negotiation, every quiet decision that compounded into something real, by refusing to let emotion drive the moment that mattered most. That night in the kitchen was the most important negotiation of my marriage, and I treated it exactly the way I'd treat a deal that had gone sideways. I gathered the facts, I presented them cleanly, and then I watched, carefully, to see what the other side actually did with the truth once they had it. What she did next is its own story. For the first week after that night, Lavisa was quiet in a way I'd never seen her be quiet before. Not sullen, not cold, just genuinely, visibly unmoored, like someone who'd been given a map that contradicted every direction they'd been walking in for years. She didn't tell anyone what had happened, not even Rose, which I noticed, because for 6 years almost nothing in her life had gone untold to Rose. I think she needed time to figure out which version of the story she was even going to live in now, before she could decide which version to tell anyone else. On the 9th day, she asked if we could talk properly, not in the kitchen, not in passing, but sitting down, with the kids at her parents' for the night. I've been trying to understand why I did it, she said. We were on the back patio, the same patio where I'd overheard her tell Rose she had us covered, and I don't think the symmetry was lost on either of us. And I don't have a good answer. I think some of it really was that I didn't understand what you were doing, and not understanding felt like evidence that it wasn't working. If you'd shown me a spreadsheet 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have known what I was looking at anyway. But I also think I liked being the one people worried about less. Does that make sense? In my family, struggling quietly and handling it gracefully was its own kind of status. My mom did it her whole marriage. I think I built a version of that for myself without fully realizing I was doing it. I appreciated the honesty of that, even as it didn't undo the years of it. You didn't just struggle quietly, I said. You told people, repeatedly, specific, false things about me. There's a difference between not understanding my business and telling your sister I barely keep the lights on while you're the one holding this family up. I know, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on it, the first real crack I'd heard since the kitchen. I know there's a difference. I think once I started saying it, it became this thing I knew how to say. Like a script I'd memorized. And every time someone reacted the way I expected, sympathetic, a little impressed by how I was handling it, it just reinforced saying it again. I wasn't checking it against reality because the reality wasn't the point anymore. The performance was. We didn't resolve anything that night, not really. What we agreed on was smaller and more practical, that we would tell her family the truth, together, in a single conversation, rather than letting the story unwind in fragments over months of gossip and reinterpretation. And that whatever happened to the marriage after that, the lying, on both sides, the silence on mine and the narrative on hers, was going to stop. The family conversation happened 3 weeks later, at her parents' house, the same house where Richard had pulled me into the garage and offered to call his REIT friend. I brought the same laptop, the same documents. Lavisa sat beside me, which surprised me a little, given everything, but I think by then she decided that whatever came next for us, she wasn't going to let her family keep believing a story that wasn't true either, even if correcting it meant admitting her own role in building it. Richard read the numbers the way Lavisa had, slowly, then again, like a man checking his own math. Maria put her hand over her mouth. Lavisa's sister, who'd been on the other end of so many of those phone calls, just stared at the screen and then at her sister, something between confusion and a kind of retroactive embarrassment crossing her face. You let us think, Richard started, and stopped, the same way Lavisa had stopped in the kitchen weeks earlier. Yes, I said, before he could finish the thought in a way that put it all on me. And Lavisa let you think it too, for longer than I let it go uncorrected. I'm not interested in relitigating whose fault this was more. I just wanted you to have the actual picture, because you've spent years offering me jobs and worrying about your daughter carrying a struggling husband, and none of that was ever true, and I think you deserve to know that before it went any further. Richard didn't apologize that day, not directly, not in a way that felt complete, but something in how he shook my hand on the way out was different than it had been in years. Maria hugged me, which she had never once done in 9 years of marriage, and said, quietly, I wish someone had told me the truth a long time ago. I worried about you too more than I needed to. The marriage itself took longer to figure out than the family conversation did. We went to counseling, not the dramatic, crisis intervention kind, but the slow, unglamorous kind, the kind where you spend most sessions talking about smaller things, communication patterns, how silence functions in each of our families of origin, how my father's lessons about leverage and patience had quietly become a habit of withholding that extended far beyond business, how Lavisa's family's particular brand of status anxiety had taught her to perform struggle as a virtue. We didn't fix everything. I don't think marriages get fixed the way a property gets renovated, all at once, on a clean timeline, with a defined end state. But 6 months out from that night in the kitchen, we were still together, and the conversations in our house had changed in a way I can only describe as more honest, in both directions. I started telling her real numbers. Not performatively, not as some kind of trophy reveal, just as a habit, the way you'd update a business partner. She started asking real questions, actual questions about underwriting and cash flow and how I evaluated a deal, not because she needed to manage the portfolio, but because she'd decided, I think for the first time in our marriage, that she actually wanted to understand the thing I'd built instead of just feeling either threatened by it or comfortable narrating its absence. I ran into Danish from the school fundraiser a few months later, at a different event, a fall carnival this time. He asked, with the same easy confidence as before, how the real estate thing was holding up. It's at 38 properties now, I said. About 50 million in equity. Closed 2 more deals last month. I watched the same recalibration happen on his face that had happened on Lavisa's in the kitchen, the quiet internal math of a man revising an entire mental file in real time. He didn't say much after that beyond a slightly stunned wow, that's incredible, and I didn't push it further. I wasn't there to humiliate him. I genuinely wasn't there to humiliate anyone, not even Lavisa, not even in the moment I turned that laptop screen toward her in the kitchen. I was there to stop a 6-year-old lie from continuing to define how my own family saw me, in my own house, in front of my own children. Hyra is 9 now. She knows, in age-appropriate terms, that I buy old buildings and fix them up and rent them out, and that it's a real job even though it doesn't look like the jobs her friends' parents have. She asked me once, with the bluntness only a 9-year-old has, why I didn't just tell everyone how much money we had a long time ago. I told her the truth, that I thought, for a long time, that staying quiet about it was a kind of strength, and that I'd learned, the hard way, that there's a difference between quiet strength and a silence that lets other people fill in the wrong story about who you are. I told her that real strength sometimes means showing people the truth even when silence would be easier, because the people who love you deserve the real picture, not the one that's most comfortable to assume. She thought about that for a second, in the very serious way she thinks about most things, and said, so you should have just told her the spreadsheet a long time ago. Out of the mouths of 9-year-olds. She wasn't entirely wrong. I think about that kitchen night often, not with regret exactly, but with a clearer understanding of what it actually cost both of us, the years where a true, good thing I'd built quietly became, in the retelling, a story about my failure instead of my work. I don't think Lavisa set out to humiliate me when she first started softening the truth to her sister all those years ago. I think she filled an empty room with the furniture that made the most sense to her, the way my father said she would. But I also think I built that empty room on purpose, for longer than I needed to, because some part of me preferred being underestimated to being known, because being underestimated, at least, felt like it was on my terms. It wasn't, not really. Nobody's story about you is ever fully on your terms if you never tell them the truth yourself. We're still together. The portfolio crossed 52 million last quarter. Jack started asking me, recently, what a tenant is, and I caught myself smiling at the question the way my own father must have smiled the first time I asked him what a deed was, standing in the back room of his hardware store 30-some years ago, not knowing yet that the quiet, patient thing he was teaching me would end up being the same quality that almost cost me my marriage before it finally, slowly, helped save it. If you've ever built something quietly while the people around you told a different, smaller story about who you are, I'd want you to know two things. The first is that the building itself was never wasted, no matter what anyone said about it in the meantime. The second is that silence has a cost too, even when it's strategic, even when it's earned, even when you think you're protecting something by keeping it. Eventually, somebody you love is going to fill that silence with whatever story makes the most sense to them. And you might not like what they build there. Drop a comment and let me know, would you have shown her the numbers sooner, or do you think the silence was worth it in the end? And if this story meant something to you, subscribe, because we tell real stories here, and we're just getting started.